Well, first Detroit goes bust. Will New York and Chicago be next? The mayors of those two cities warning that their public pension costs are growing totally out of control, which is really what did in Detroit. And many other cities are facing the same time bomb. So is this proof it's time to scrap public pensions before they all go bust? Hi, everybody. I'm Davis Asman. Welcome to Forbes on Fox. Let's go in focus with Steve Forbes, Rick Unger, John Tamny, Rich Karlgaard, Sabrina Schaeffer, and Elizabeth McDonald. John Tamny, should we scrap these public pensions?
Yes, get rid of them. What is public service? It is a sacrifice. It's supposed to be a short-term sacrifice before you go back into the private sector and produce real economic growth. The problem now with high government pay and big pension plans is that we are creating lifelong government workers that are a burden on all the people working in the real economy. If you get rid of them, they will have an incentive to get back into the real world, and cities will no longer have pension problems.
Well, Rick, and the pension problems are just enormous. New York City, just as one example, and this is repeated in many cities over the country, it has 5,000 fewer cops now than it did 10 years ago. But the price of the police force is double. Why? Because the pension costs have quadrupled. So we have fewer cops, 5,000 fewer cops. We're paying twice as much for them because of pension costs.
Now, that's true. I do have to start out taking a bit of issue with what John said, because I don't think policemen and firemen would agree that they should be risking their lives as a privilege to serve us. So you have to be a little bit careful with that. And you're right, David. Look, in New York, 95% of every public employee doesn't contribute a nickel to their retirement. That is not okay. I think we have to be careful. We don't need to scrap these programs. We can't forget about people who have worked their whole career expecting their pension, but it is time to reform them.
Well, and Steve, that's the question. How do you do it? Because Detroit is not going to be the only city that goes bust.
Yeah, the problem is, unless it does file for bankruptcy, cities cannot scrap most of these plans because they have state constitutions which say you can't do that. So they're going to have to negotiate with these unions to do it. What they should start with is having 401k plans for new workers, and then try, if you get higher interest rates, to annuitize what their obligations have been so far, and then cap it in the future.
And, Rich, the problem really is with the idea of public sector unions, because they're not beholden to the taxpayers, we who pay their bills. They're beholden to politicians, and politicians rely on them to get reelected. That's why they have these unsustainable deals.
Yeah, and unfortunately, our politicians are mathematically ignorant. You take an example, CalPERS, which manages the California State Pension Fund. It is assuming a 7.5% annual return from now until Armageddon. Well, nobody's getting 7.5% today without putting their money at risk. 5% is a much more realistic assumption today. And so pensions should be cut by a third right off the bat to reflect real market returns.
And EMAC, of course, if you did that, you'd have all these public sector strikes, which are supposed to be illegal in many places. They're really not. They call in these sick-in days and so forth. So that's what we're going to be stuck with. We're going to be stuck with chaos coming up very soon, are we not?
Yeah, and you're right. And also, you know, these politicians like Mayor Bloomberg, who's focused on big gulp sodas and salt and foods, I'm telling you, I've said it before. It's like, you know, the house is on fire and they're still smoking in bed. And here's what's going on.
That's a good analogy.
You know, we see already reform happening. You can change the structure of a pension, government pension, for future hires, meaning into a 401k. They're doing it in places like San Diego and Alaska. Utah's doing reform. So is Washington, D.C. You can also, unfortunately, you can cut unfunded health care benefits. So they can be cut without going to court. That's already happening in Stockton and Vallejo. And the thing is, the irony here, David, is that already health reform may be taking care of this problem. Health reform, they're starting to weigh whether to hire new workers or cut back on city services. So that's the bottom line. Do you cut back on government services like police and firemen, or do you reform the pension system?
Well, Sabrina, EMAC mentioned that the private sector is doing a lot of reforms in their own pension programs. The problem is, if they try to do that in the public sector, you know we're going to see strikes everywhere. We're going to see these public sector unions trying to shut down these cities.
There might be, but there's the other side of the story, which are the American taxpayers. I mean, there are other hardworking Americans out there who shouldn't have to shoulder the bill for unreasonable compensation packages. I think what Liz said and what Steve said earlier is important. That is that the financial landscape is shifting. Gallup recently found that current retirees are relying largely on pensions and Social Security, but those approaching retirement, future retirees are planning on relying on their 401ks and their IRAs. So I think it's important to remember that people are getting more accustomed to to doing these kind of private, individualized savings plans, and we need to start shifting with those younger workers.
Okay, but Steve, this is, again, we've always been putting it off in the future. The problem is right now. What happened to Detroit, they suddenly woke up one morning and realized they were broke. That's going to happen. Charlton, West Virginia, a little mid-sized city in America. Right now, they're paying for their retiree costs out of the budget. That's a Ponzi scheme. That can only last for a couple more months.
Yeah, the pay-as-you-go never works, and making promises that you can't afford to keep never work either. Unfortunately, David, it's going to take one more big city to go bust before you're going to be able to sit down and negotiate these other pension plans.
Which one do you think it'll be, by the way?
Could be Chicago. They have a real disaster coming up in 2015.
Yeah, I'll tell you
that
something.
might force something on that. And one of the areas you can get creative on, David, is health savings accounts for retirees and for current workers, which give people money which they control and end up costing less.
Steve, isn't the administration going in exactly the opposite direction?
Yes, but there's nothing like reality, especially if you're a mayor facing a bankruptcy, to sit down and start doing some of these reforms.
Yeah,
all right, Emac, you want to talk about Chicago?
Illinois is a case in point. Their pension costs are 2.5 times what the state brings in tax revenues. The taxpayers, it's so unfair. Sabrina's right. It is so unfair what's happening to U.S. taxpayers across the country with property taxes continue to go up when we have beach lifeguards in Orange County, California, retiring at age 51, getting $108,000 ad infinitum. Yeah, I should have taken that job too.
Rick, isn't the real problem public sector unions themselves? I mean, their boss, their manager, it's not like the private sector where you work on a for-profit system. Their boss, their paymaster are us, the taxpayer.
Yeah, the real problem, the honest answer is on both sides of this equation. And you can say that people who have been running these cities have been a little bit too kowtowing to the unions themselves.
A little bit.
I'm acknowledging it's a fair statement. But we also know we're seeing the same thing that we've seen at the national level. No planning. You knew this day was coming when you were going to get to these massive retirements, and politicians just didn't bother worrying about it.
Yeah, but John Tammy, some people knew about this when they saw the creation of public sector unions. They worried about teachers going on strike. They worried about a lot of things, including pension costs going too high because politicians would promise them the moon for their political support.
And people are not.
Hold on, John Tamny, go ahead.
Even FDR, of all people, worried about this, so your point is correct. And I think we've got to get back to the basic truth that government employment shouldn't be a lifetime concept. And the way to make it not that way is to make the pay lower, to not give out these gold-plated pensions so that people have an incentive to get back into the productive private sector and not be a burden on taxpayers.
Sabrina, go on.
Well, that's exactly right. We don't want to be pitting public sector employees against private sector employees. And right now, the American people have a very negative view.
No, but Sabrina,
isn't
where private sector unions are okay because they're going against the management, which is a private company, public sector unions are going against us. If they strike, it's us, the taxpayer. We're the ones who pay their bills. So isn't there something screwy about the idea of public sector unions?
There are, because this is why 42% of Americans feel that unions should have less power, because they feel as though they are being benefited at their expense. And that is the real problem here, is, who are we going to favor? We can't pick winners and losers, with these different unions.
Rich Carter, we started talking about scrapping public sector pensions. What about scrapping public sector unions?
Oh, well, I think that's a great idea. I think they should be illegal. John Tamny pointed out that even labor stalwart FDR was against them. And to that, I would add labor leader George Meany. I mean, it created what inevitably is going to be a Ponzi scheme, and now it's all collapsing.
Well, by the way, FDR was against striking of the unions and unions using collective bargaining. I think he favored public sector unions, but he was against the collective bargaining program of public sector unions. But, Steve, there's no way to avoid it. Eventually, the only tool that a union has to get what it wants is a strike, right?
Yeah, well, one way to deal with unions, David, is what Wisconsin and others are doing, and that is give people a choice about paying dues. Suddenly, they'd rather have the money than giving it to a union. Okay. And again, 401ks, you can promise the moon, but if you don't put the money in, they know it's not there.
And remember, by the way, the union mobs in Wisconsin lost their battle against Scott Walker, so unions beware. Coming up next, you're going to have to deal with the high costs. Well, so much for lawmakers taking the same medicine that they impose on the rest of us. Under the health care law, Congress and thousands of congressional staffers were going to be hit with massive premium hikes. But now the president cut them a deal. And guess who's going to be paying their health care costs? That's right, you and me. So, Steve, is this a good idea?
Well, it just goes to show if the cooking is so great, why don't they eat it? The fact of the matter
Because it's poison.
The fact of the matter is they don't like it. And as for the saying, well, we'll have a brain drain, that assumes there are brains to drain. And if there are, they should be in the private sector. So eat your own cooking, guys, and find out what it's like. And if these people are so essential, then give them a pay raise and let the taxpayers decide if they want to spend that extra money.
And, Rick, it's actually that we're going to keep paying, because we already pay their salaries, their benefits, so their parking bills, et cetera.
So thank you. I'm glad you said that, because I was going to. Look, I mean, this is...
But that's the point, is that we're paying a lot for these guys. Should we?
Well, that's a whole separate question. So let's put that aside. I would say yes. I suspect you would say no.
Right.
So putting that aside, this is a made-to-order PR thing for people who are against the Obamacare. I get it. This is the result of a little number that a GOP senator pulled at the beginning. It all went in a certain direction, and it was ill-planned. It was silly. Here's what's really happening. Congress is being treated now like a small business. They can go to the exchanges. In fact, they still have to go to the exchanges, and they are entitled to pay a portion of the premiums and pay whatever portion they decide to pay of their employees. It's no different than what happens to anybody working here at Fox who has their insurance covered by their employer.
But Sabrina, all right, Sabrina, there's a huge difference between the private sector and the difference is, as in the lax side, we're paying the bills for the public sector. The taxpayers are paying the bills. And now they have this new system that's supposed to be great for everybody, but not for them.
Right, that's exactly it. I think Michael Cannon at the Cato Institute put it perfectly recently. He said, look, now we have a ruling class versus the rest of us. Right. And Obamacare is for the commoners. It's for the rest of us. And all of these people up in Congress are getting out of it. And it's not just Congress. That's what the story's been focused on. What about President Obama and his family? What about the Justice Department and their families, the Supreme Court and their families, federal judges, and 1,200 corporations and unions? This is picking winners and losers at its worst.
And, Bill, why are they called public servants? Because we are serving them time and time and time again. This is just another example.
I know you feel like an oppressed vassal in a feudal system.
Yes,
it's not that.
Yes, I do, as a matter of fact. It's just like the Hunger Games.
Obama said
1% of that 1% of the population living in the district live like princes and kings. It ain't, by the way, it ain't surprising that Forbes is the one that reminded us that the most affluent community in all of America is, guess where? Chevy Chase, Maryland. It's the district. Those guys are living like kings.
Okay, but Obama said if you have a health care plan and you like it, you can keep it. Why not let these poor slobs keep their plan? If Steve thinks they're overpaid, let him put through a bill through his congressman to cut their pay. Private sector people aren't taking pay cuts.
All right. Well, John, the fact is that we got this new health care law. All Americans believe the taxes are that we're going to be paying more because of this health care bill. And this is like insult to injury, is it not, John?
Yeah, I mean, D.C. is the Hunger Games, and the last thing you want to do is create an
By the
incentive
way, for those who don't know, hold on
a
second, John. Let me just, for those who haven't seen the Hunger Games, and you should, because it's a great movie, that's where 1% of the population lives in the capital, and 99% of the population feeds that 1%. So they live like kings, the rest live like paupers. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, government workers are an economy-suffocating burden, and the last thing you want to do is create an incentive for more people to go to work for government. If anything, they should have a more onerous health plan so that they have an incentive to exit the government sector and not be a burden on us.
And Mike, meanwhile, what they are worrying about inside Beltway, the Beltway crowd, is that they're going to have this big brain drain. The Hill newspaper came out with this thing that lawmakers are worried about a brain drain of talent and skill from Capitol Hill, and God forbid they'll go to the private sector. First of all, are you worried about a brain drain?
No, not at all, David, but that's the hypocrisy of Obamacare, because when a lot of people in the private sector said that's one of the problems with this bill, it's going to cause a brain drain in the private sector, they denied that. They said, no, that wouldn't happen. And oh, by the way, lots of people have lost their coverage with Obamacare. It's just one more thing about this that the president said that is not true.
And by the way, Steve, maybe we could use a brain drain inside D.C. These are the brains that gave us this convoluted law to begin with.
Yeah, and since they did, they can live under it. And Obama, as usual, is not telling us the real truth here. Private plans, David, are going to be under severe pressure starting in 2015. And you're already seeing it in the fact that we're now creating more part-time workers than full-time workers. That is a scandal. Washington lives well. We pay for it.
According to the president, you're supposed to have the plan that you want. The only people that are getting exactly what they want are the people inside the Beltway. Coming up.